war, and you also said, Mr. Ayad, that we can consummate our rights with them and have children from these women. Well, he gave us the example of the Prophet Muhammad when he killed the Jews of Banu Qurayza. He took the tribesman leader and consummated his right on his way back to camp in a tent. And one student, I remember, asked a question. He says, well, isn't that considered adultery because you're not married to this woman? He says, no, it's not adultery. One student asked a question. He said, is it consensual? And he said, it doesn't have to be consensual. I went to my father. I asked my father. I said, Father, we're learning this in school. What is your opinion? You taught Islamic studies and English language. He says, you will have the river of Al-Kawthar to back you up. We will kill the Jews in that day. This is why they're back here in this country, so we can finally annihilate them. And you hear speeches all over the Middle East from Lebanon, from Nasrallah, from Ahmadinejad, from all over the circles from the Islamic fundamentalist movement that says that the Jews come back to one place, so it makes the job much easier for us so we can continue with the Holocaust of the Jewish people. Of course, from my social studies, whether it's history, I never took a trip to Yad Vashem, even though Israel showed footage on the Holocaust. I remember our first TV set, black and white television set. We plugged that television in. It was the time of Yom HaShoah for Israel, where they would show days of footage of the Holocaust. I remember watching the Holocaust footage, eating popcorn with my sister, my brother, and by the time I went to school, we asked the teacher questions about the Holocaust. We were curious. What is the stuff they're showing on television? Of course, the Holocaust was a Zionist fabrication. It was a Zionist conspiracy. In fact, many of my critics say that I've been paid by Zionists to speak here in front of you tonight. The Holocaust was a conspiracy. It was a fabrication in order to establish the Zionist state. Well, where did they find all these scrawny bodies? What kind of a diet plan were the Jews on so they can fabricate this whole story? Not being able to go to Yad Vashem, not being able to, live a Western kind of a culture. My mother, however, all this time, for 35 years, she wanted to escape back to the United States of America. In 55 Muslim states today, not one of them is signatory to the Hague Convention, which means if a Muslim decides to marry a Christian girl or a Jewish girl, and he decides to go back to his homeland, and he decides to keep the children back in that country, there's nothing that your embassy or your country can do for you, because they are not signatory to this convention, because they feel that they have an obligation towards Muslim children who have a right to live in Muslim countries and not to be evicted back to a Christian country. Her attempt was always to escape. She wanted to run. Her whole story is, how can I escape? I remember my mother's first attempt to escape when we were children. She took the luggage, and you might think it's very easy. You just pick up your luggage, you pack your things, and you get on the taxi cab, you go to Ben Gurion Airport, you take the next flight to New York, and you connect to California and go home. Well, she tried that. She took the kids, and of course the women from the balconies would see her with the luggage, and they knew what she had in mind. She had to go to the embassy and file some paperwork because she had no passport, she had nowhere to prove who she is, and she had to spend one night at the YMCA hotel in Jerusalem. And the second day in the morning, she attempted to go to the Consulate General, and of course, my uncles, my family, my father realized what she was about to do. They waited for her at the entrance of the American consulate. She was, of course, caught and sent back to the House of Obedience with enough beatings to teach her a lesson. At this point, everybody in my family, in my school, even the barber, will tell us how not to trust our mother and not to escape back to America. The Americans, of course, in our school were taught as imperialists and what have you. And now her dilemma was, how can she escape with all three children and having to convince those kids to go with her? Because at any inkling my mother wanted to escape, we ourselves as kids will turn her in. She would not want to leave the country without all three children. So for 35 years, my mother remained captive in a system that she didn't want to be part of. She wanted to escape all her life. She couldn't leave until 1994, because in 1993 I decided to change my religion, and I became a Christian basically, and rescued her in 1994, brought her back to her country, and she is with her mother, back to her family. And it's really her story that needs to be told. Because the question I always ask is, whenever do you hear a story of a Muslim girl falling in love with a non-Muslim boy, a Hindu or a Christian or a Jew, and being allowed to marry this guy? It's always the case of a Muslim male marrying a non-Muslim female or a Christian girl, and you never hear the vice versa of the story. I've very rarely ever heard of such a story of a Muslim girl marrying a Christian boy. It happens maybe on occasion, but the majority of the stories is always that a Muslim can have the right to marry a non-Muslim girl. Of course, living in the Middle East, going to Friday prayers, going to the Temple Mount, listening to sermons by Ikrimah Sabri, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Even the Wailing Wall doesn't belong to the Jewish people. I went to school all my life in Dar Jasser in Bethlehem. And in Dar Jasser school, I was right adjacent to Rachel's tomb. Never knew who Rachel was all my life there. Who was Rachel? Qabr Rahil. Didn't understand who Rachel was. Didn't understand the history of Jerusalem or the connectivity of the Jewish people to that land. Of course, from listening to all the sermons, religious education, social studies, historical studies, we were the original Canaanites. We had the presence in this land way before the Jewish presence, because we wanted the connectivity to the presence to this land way before the Jewish existence or the Joshuan conquest. So we were the Canaanites. You can hear Yasser Arafat, Al-Husseini, all the prominent figures of the Palestinians saying that we were the original Jebusites or we were the Canaanites. I began to ask myself a question in 1993 as I read the Bible, because Canaan was the son of Ham. How could Canaan be a Hamite? And we consider ourselves Arabs, of course, Arabs from Abraham. How could we be Canaanites and Hamitic origin and also a Semitic origin at the same time? Of course, I began as a youth as a graffitist. I began to write graffiti on the walls. I began to entice other kids to go on demonstrations against Israel. The idea of destroying Israel have never left our mind in school. Of course, the Israel education system didn't allow an Israeli system to enter into our school. We had our education curricula coming from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and it didn't have any of the open kind of a critical thinking that you enjoy here in the West, to think critically or to ask questions. In the Middle East, all my life I lived there, there's usually one party line or the coffin. I mean, you could be pro-PFLP, Popular Front to Liberate Palestine, you could be pro-PLO, you could be pro-Hamas, but one thing we were all pro is that we had the idea that Israel must be wiped out and we must establish a state. In fact, I always ask myself the question, prior to 1967, the Palestinian Charter never even included the land that we call Judea, the West Bank. It was never included part of that charter. What happened? I mean, after all, we wanted to establish a state in Palestine, yet it seems like the secretary forgot to type Palestine and, in that land we call Judea, biblical Judea, as that state. Because we were proud Jordanians. I was considered a Jordanian. My father served in the Jordanian army. We saluted King Hussein in going to theater or go to school. We had the Jordanian national anthem. We were all Jordanians. And all of a sudden, after the Six-Day War, the charter was changed, and now Palestine is to be established in that land called Judea. Well, Palestine was supposed to be established in Israel proper, where the Jews were. It took me years to realize why. Well, it's because the idea of establishing a Palestinian state when King Hussein ruled it was an anathema. He's an Arab ruling Arab country, and Gaza was ruled by Jamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt. So Gaza was considered Egypt. There was no problem with us being ruled by other Arabs. The idea was to be, rejection of being ruled by a Zionist or a Jew.